Now, I would like to present Denis Alexander for his speech named "Is Evolution is a Chance Process?"
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and let me just say what a great joy it is to be back in Turkey again. I used to live in Ankara for quite a while, and it's lovely to be back with you again. And I want to just start by thanking the organizers for this kind invitation to participate in this conference on what is really a very important topic. So one of the fascinating features of Darwinian evolution has been the way in which the strict biological theory has become so invested with different ideologies. We've been hearing about that already this morning. And it's often the case that atheistic and materialistic ideologies try and obtain their ideology from what they think is the chance or random aspects of the evolutionary process. That was mentioned this morning as well. For example, here we have the atheistic philosopher, the late Daniel Dennett. He died a couple of weeks ago. In fact, he asks whether the complexity of biological diversity, and I quote from Dennett here, can really be the outcome of nothing but a cascade of algorithmic processes feeding on chance. And if so, who designed that cascade? So Dennett answers his own rhetorical question by saying, nobody. It is itself the product of a blind algorithmic process, close quote. And then he goes on to say evolution is not a process that was designed to produce us. Here we have another American philosopher, this time Alex Rosenberg, professor of philosophy at Duke University, writing here in his article, Darwin's Nihilistic Idea. And he declares that Darwinism puts the capstone on denying that there is any meaning or purpose to the universe, its contents, and its cosmic history. And just as a third example to show how people try and use, philosophers especially, try and use evolution in an ideological way, here is an rather old biological textbook here, but it makes the point. And in this textbook, the authors write that the real difficulty in accepting Darwin's theory has always been that it seems to diminish our significance. Evolution asked us to accept the proposition that, like all other organisms, we too are the products of a random process that, as far as science can show, we are not created for any special purpose or as part of any universal design, close quote. And so all of this, of course, this commentary raises the question of how do we really interpret the word chance within evolutionary biology? And I think in general popular culture, I think most people imagine that evolution is some sort of chance process. Well, first of all, let's just ask Charles Darwin that question, because he wrote quite a bit about chance. And when he published The Origin of Species in 1859, it was widely presented as a theory that depended on chance, thereby leading some to natural anxieties about the theory's implications. But here we have Darwin writing in the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, 1872, and he writes in this way. I'm not going to read the whole quotation here, but just in the relevant part here, he says, I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if the variations were due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation, close quote. And so the word chance can be used in Darwin's writings simply to express our ignorance concerning the actual mechanisms involved. And Darwin was also insistent that the composition of living things in a certain habitat defined by its history and by its environment were very far from being any kind of process of chance, as we've already been hearing this morning. Here's just one more quotation from Darwin. He was saying that when we look at the plants and bushes on a wonderful entangled bank, he wrote that we are tempted to attribute their proportional numbers and kinds as to what we call chance. But how false a view is this, says Darwin. The reason why it was false, he explains, is because of the natural selection. We've been already thinking about natural selection this morning. And here I just quote again from The Origin of Species, and I quote, "But if variations useful to any organic being ever do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life. And from the strong principle of inheritance, these will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized, and this principle of preservation, or the survival of the fittest, I have called natural selection." Now, I think it's quite interesting, in fact, to find that the atheist Richard Dawkins agrees with Darwin on the subject of chance. A lot of people miss this quotation that you can find in the preface to Richard Dawkins' best-selling book, The Blind Watchmaker. And there, Richard Dawkins writes this. He gives us the reason why he wants to write this book. Take, for instance, he says, the issue of chance, often dramatized as blind chance. The great majority of people that attack Darwinism leap with almost unseemly eagerness to the mistaken idea that there is nothing other than random chance in it. Since living complexity embodies the very antithesis of chance, if you think that Darwinism is tantamount to chance, you'll obviously find it easy to refute Darwinism. One of my tasks in this book, he writes, will be to destroy this eagerly believed myth that Darwinism is a theory of chance. So this is one of the very few points in which I agree with Richard Dawkins when it comes to philosophy and theology. So here, of course, Richard Dawkins is reacting against the claims made by creationists that you can reject evolution because you think it's a theory of chance. And I think what it means is that we need to think carefully about what these words really mean in biology and what the word random means as well. And we need to see how the way these words are used in evolution and biology are actually different from the ways in which they're used in mathematics. So the word chance in both Turkish and English, as in many languages, is actually quite slippery because it can have many different meanings. So I just want to review now the two main meanings of chance relevant to our present topic, and they're all related to the question of uncertainty. The first we can call epistemic chance because it refers to all those events that are perfectly law-like in how they happen, but about which we have insufficient knowledge of their antecedents to make predictions, like coin tossing, for example, okay. And so Darwin's use of the word chance in his Origin of Species was explicitly epistemic in places. As we've already quoted, Darwin saw that his use of the word chance was a wholly incorrect expression. But, he said, it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation. And so here Darwin is clearly referring to epistemic chance. The second type of chance we can call ontological chance, because there are no antecedents that could possibly be known that could enable a prediction, even in principle. And so in this case, it's not a question of lack of knowledge. There is no knowledge that can be known. And this is sometimes called pure chance, because there is nothing that we can know which has predictive value. Now, if I claimed, for example, that it was pure chance that I met Erkan down at the marketplace last Saturday, I might well be understood in colloquial speech and daily speech, but formally I would be wrong, because there certainly were antecedents that could be cited to explain our unexpected meeting. For example, Erkan always goes to the market on a Saturday, like me. Erkan always buys a karpuz at the market, like me, and so forth. So our meeting was therefore a chance event epistemically, but not ontologically. And so, as an example of ontological chance, we can think about radioactive decay. The random emission of a radioactive particle certainly appears to be an example, doesn't it, of ontological chance. We need to use the word appears because we can never be 100% sure that there aren't some hidden variables or hidden reason why a particular radioisotope emits a particle of radiation energy at one moment rather than another. But to the best of our current knowledge, there is no such hidden reasons. Now, in practice, this makes no difference at all to our use of radioisotopes for all kinds of purposes in medical research. For example, I've spent much of my working life using the radioisotope phosphorus P32 in my experiments. And the non-radioactive form of phosphorus found most commonly in our bodies is phosphorus 31. It has just one less neutron than its radioactive counterpart. So, phosphorus 32 is made in nuclear reactors, taken off to the lab, and then it decays by its half-life being 14.3 days. And so even though the timing of each emission of each radioactive particle of energy is unknown, averaging out trillions of those events very quickly generates the precise value of 14.3 days for the half-life. And of course, the same is true of all the other radioisotopes. So, we can now ask the question, is the ontological chance of quantum mechanics at all relevant to the mechanisms of evolutionary biology? The answer I want to give here is only indirectly and without playing any kind of central role. And the reason is that in the vast majority of biological processes, including, to the best of our knowledge, the brain, specific single events at the quantum level make no difference. This is because the processes involve the interactions of molecules, each one of which has properties that represents the average of trillions of quantum events. And so one single quantum event makes no difference to the organism most of the time. Now, in photosynthesis, the process whereby the sun's energy is converted into chemical energy in plants and some bacteria, that might not be the case. Though the involvement of quantum events in photosynthesis still remains rather controversial. But, of course, when such quantum events occur trillions of times cumulatively, this results in plant growth. So at the level which counts, the conversion of photons of light into plant energy, accompanied by the production of oxygen, the process is stable and it's predictable. Now, other quantum events are also involved in biology, in vision, in the action of various enzymes, probably also in the mechanisms whereby animals navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. And in animal navigation, the radical pair hypothesis suggests that the quantum mechanics of electron spins could form the basis of a kind of magnetic compass sense, a wonderful way of traveling around the world. But in all cases, the quantum events are playing roles in overall systems which are highly organized and orderly with consistent functions and purposes. They are not some hidden source of pure chance coming into biological processes viewed at a functional level. But, you might want to say, could one maybe invoke ionizing radiation as a source of pure chance within the evolutionary process? For example, let's think about a lion here. We have some lions on the screen. Ionizing radiation particle might cause the death of lion A from cancer at one moment, when that would not have happened had the particle been emitted at another moment. For example, the lion had just entered a cave and so was protected in some way. Now, because of that event, lion A was no longer alive to eat antelope B, which went on to have a large and successful family of baby antelopes, shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. So in other words, the precise trajectory of future evolution might be affected once this particular mutation had occurred. But we notice here the proviso precise trajectory. As we'll discuss more in a moment, for natural selection to occur, the source of genetic variation is really irrelevant, be it by radiation or by chemical mutagenesis or by errors taking place as cells replicate. Natural selection ensures that the overall process is one of epistemic rather than ontological chance. Right, so now, having considered two of the main meanings of chance, epistemic and ontological, let's now just think about how the word random is used often in evolutionary biology, and we'll go on to contrast that meaning with how it's used in the field of mathematics. Now, when we biologists speak of random mutations in evolution, what we're referring to is the fact that the mutation occurs in the DNA, in the genes, without the well-being or otherwise of the organism in view. In other words, their occurrence of mutations is not influenced in any way by the needs of the individual organism in which they occur. By contrast, as you know, mathematicians typically use the word random to describe processes in which multiple outcomes can occur, and each is associated with a probability that gives the likelihood of that outcome. So, if we take a string of numbers, if the numbers are randomly selected, then any single number in this series will have an equal probability of being selected. And so, such a series can be generated by random number generators of the kind that can be found on many computers. And a traditional statistical approach then examines such a series of numbers to see whether they display the property of randomness. No single number can be random. It is rather the process whereby the numbers have been generated that can be assessed as being random. And that process can only be assessed with a very long list of numbers. And so no part of that series of numbers should provide any information at all about the properties of any other part of the series. Now, let's come back to biology and ask whether this mathematical understanding of randomness is a feature of evolutionary mechanisms, and the answer is no. And the best place to look for randomness might be in mutational changes in the sequence of an organism's DNA. So, we humans, we have 3.2 billion nucleotides, or genetic ladders, that make up our own human DNA. And if the mutations were truly random, then they would be equally likely to occur at any position in the DNA. There you are on the right-hand side of the screen. You have a string of DNA letters, or nucleotide bases. But they do not occur mathematically randomly in that sequence. And there I've just given you a summary of a big Dutch study where they took 200 family trios, we call them trios, mother, father, baby. They sequenced the genome of those three individuals out of 250. That's quite a lot of sequencing. And they found that on average there were 38 new mutations appear in the newborn that were not in the parents. When you have a baby, your baby will have new mutations. They're not in the mother, they're not in the father, these are new. They happen through cell replication. Now, if the mutations, if those average 38 new mutations, if they were randomly distributed throughout the genome, then on average there should be some very big gaps between them. In fact, they should be separated by a median of about 84 million nucleotides, referring to the genetic ladders of the DNA. But they are not. For example, researchers found that there were 78 instances in which there were clusters of 2 to 3 mutations found within just 20,000 nucleotides of each other, which is a very much smaller number than 84 million. So what you get is clustering of mutations. They're not random in a mathematical sense. Now, I could give you many other such examples. Here's one on the screen there. This is actually from rapidly dividing yeast cells. They've been treated with a mutagen, and then they looked at where the mutations were found, and you can see that there's a great cluster of mutations there on chromosome number 2, right up the right-hand side of the screen there. In fact, a recent review listed around 8 different ways in which the molecular machinery involved in DNA replication can lead to a greater probability that mutations occur in clusters rather than mutations being randomly distributed. And so the generation of genomic mutational hotspots is actually thought to have played a critical role in our own human evolution. Yes, so DNA Mutations then provide the raw material, if you like, of the evolutionary process, which generates slightly different phenotypes upon which natural selection can then operate. And such genetic variation can arise in many different ways, in fact. It can happen, as we've been thinking, through radiation, through chemical mutagens, through sexual reproduction, through what we call gene flow, retroviral insertions. We have retroviruses that insert their DNA into the genome. That may happen millions of years ago, but we've been making millions of miles of DNA, millions of kilometers of DNA as we sat here this afternoon. We're making it all the time. It's amazing, isn't it? We have chromosomal rearrangements as well, and other mechanisms as well. So there are many, many different ways in which variation comes into the genome. And so the variation is random in the biological sense, because it arises without the well-being of the organism in mind at all, but the variation is non-random in the mathematical sense. Okay, so we can now go on to ask a further question. What types of chance then are involved in generating genetic variation, the raw material of evolution? Well, clearly there is plenty of epistemic chance involved in the mechanisms of mutation. The mechanisms are generally far too complex to make any specific predictions as far as individual mutations are concerned. However, once we start averaging large numbers, then well-justified generalizations can be made about such items as mutation rates, where mutations are more likely to occur in the genome, which chromosomes are more likely to undergo mutational changes, structural changes, and so on. And so the molecular mechanisms underlying mutational changes just follow the normal rules of physics and chemistry. And in some cases, we're able to link susceptibility of particular regions of the genome to mutational change with the evolution of the organism involved. And of course, if there were no mutations at all, then life would be completely static. There would be no evolution, and so we would not be here. There would be no life, no carbon-based life on planet Earth. Maybe, except perhaps some very early replicating life forms. But if mutations were completely unrestrained, completely uncontrolled, then nothing would be alive, because all the information in the genome would end up as nonsense. In fact, it's been estimated that at least 10,000 DNA damage events occur every day in every cell of the human body, remembering that our bodies contain around 10 to the 13 cells. That's amazing, isn't it? 10 to the 1,000, 10,000 DNA damage events every cell of our bodies. And so there is a kind of mutation thermostat in our bodies, in all human bodies, in all animal bodies, in all plants, and that kind of controls the mutation rate. And so there's a kind of buffer that corresponds to the lowering of the thermostat, and that's provided by the repair enzymes that are rapidly repairing all those defects in our DNA as we sit here after our rather wonderful lunch. And they preserve that DNA, make sure the information is passed on to the next cells and so on. There are many different repair systems, and it's amazing how faithful they are on average to maintaining the information in our DNA. And of course, without those DNA repair enzymes, we'd all be dead from cancer very quickly. Okay, so now just thinking still about genetic variation. What about ontological chance and genetic variation? Well, we've already talked about radioactive particles, which display quantum uncertainty, so they do represent pure chance, something that can't be predicted even in principle. And we know that ionizing radiation can cause mutations in the DNA, and they directly break the chemical bonds that hold the genetic letters together. But it's impossible, even in principle, to predict where those mutations might occur. Ionizing radiation truly is pure chance. But does that really matter? Does that lead to a relevance for ontological chance in evolution? Well, not really, does it? Because it doesn't matter where the genetic variation comes from. Ultimately, it is natural selection that counts. Natural selection is that sieve, that very stringent kind of sieve that selects out which mutations are going to be passed on to the next generations and which will not. And so the sieve potentially operates on any kind of genetic variation. It doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it comes from pure chance or predictable chance or whatever you like, epistemic chance. It's simply still natural selection that counts in the end. So we've already been thinking about natural selection this morning, but in case you've just walked in this afternoon and you weren't around at that time, maybe this provides some definition for you of really what we're talking about with natural selection. Natural selection is the differential reproduction of alternative genetic variations determined by the fact that some variations are beneficial because they increase the probability that the organisms having them will live longer or be more fertile than organisms having alternative variations. Over the generations, beneficial variations will be preserved and multiplied. Injurious, damaging, or less beneficial variations will be eliminated. Now, in practice, there's a lot of variation in the genome which is selectively neutral. In other words, this is the kind of variation that makes no difference at all to the well-being or otherwise of the organism in question. And so the variant nucleotides at that particular position in the genome, they kind of drift around in the population. As the population is interbreeding, then they'll drift around. They'll be preserved probably. They don't do any harm. They don't do any good. They just sit there. And we have many thousands of those sorts of variations in our genomes here this afternoon. But what can happen is that as those neutral mutations accumulate in the genome of an individual, there may come a day when new functionality comes into being simply because they suddenly team up with other variations to make a difference, maybe to make a new protein product or a new regulatory sequence that makes a difference to the organism, and then suddenly natural selection can come into operation. Now, when genetic variation does make a difference to the organism, for good or for ill, the organism will tend to leave over many generations greater or fewer numbers of offspring, and as we've mentioned, we call that reproductive success. And so natural selection therefore acts as a kind of rigorous filter to really reduce the amount of genetic variation in the population. Natural selection is very conservative. It's amazing that some of the sequences of our enzymes are the same in plants and animals and us all the way through. They've been preserved because it's, if you change one little bit of that sequence in the protein amino acids, it's lethal, and so they're very tightly preserved. So if they're deleterious, of course, if they're really badly deleterious, they'll be removed from the population quite quickly because they lower reproductive success. On the other hand, those few beneficial changes that get through the filter, not many get through, but there are some who get through, and if they really give a very positive advantage to that individual animal or plant, then they will be spread through the interbreeding population quite quickly, in fact, because they bestow these reproductive benefits on the recipients. And we call that a selective sweep there, sweeping through the population. So it should by now, I hope, be clear why it does not really matter whether variation comes into the genome via the pathway of epistemic chance, most of it comes that way, or comes through ontological chance, through radiation and so forth, because in both cases, the effects of natural selection are most influential in bringing about certain constrained outcomes. I like to think of natural selection as like the potter molding the clay over a long period of time. The consequences of genetic variation are molded by the potter to shape an interbreeding population into a slightly different collection of phenotypes, phenotypes meaning the anatomy and physiology of that organism. So, genetic variation plus natural selection are the central mechanisms in Darwinian evolution, but clearly there are other important events that happen in evolutionary history which make a difference. As you'll know, about 65 million years ago, a huge asteroid struck the Earth, estimated to be up to 14 kilometers in diameter. Can you imagine that? Whew, really big. And it left a massive crater about 180 kilometers in diameter, about 48 kilometers deep, buried beneath the sediments of the Yucatan coast in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was this catastrophe that probably contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs, along probably with volcanic activity as well around this time. But as the Earth recovered from the shock and climates were restored, so new opportunities were created for adaptive radiation, the process whereby rapid diversification of species occurs in order to fill up these gaps, these empty ecological niches, these empty environments. And this is really how primates began to get a hold on the planet, becoming more common about 50 million years ago. And so the 200 primate species alive today, including us, represents the remains of an adaptive radiation that probably gave rise to about 6,000 species altogether. Now, asteroids hitting the Earth. Do such chance events as the hitting of the Earth by this large asteroid, and so altering the history of evolution during the past 65 million years, not suggest that evolution as a whole is a chance process? Well, it seems not. I want to say probably not. Not really. I mean, clearly there's plenty of epistemic chance here, given that there is no way that we could describe all the antecedents of these processes. However, it is worth noting that the orbits of asteroids, at least large ones, are now well known. Asteroid orbits are in principle as predictable as Earth or Sun orbits. In any case, had the asteroid not hit Earth 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs would have eventually gone extinct anyway, perhaps for climatic reasons, as all species eventually do, especially species comprising large animals. Darwinian processes end up with replenishing the Earth once again in the end, even though there may be some pretty big extinctions along the way. Now, none of what I've said so far today should be interpreted as making us think that natural selection, variation, natural selection are the only two mechanisms involved in evolutionary biology. There are plenty of other candidates around that are important as well. There's quite a discussion going on at the moment amongst evolutionary biologists about other possible mechanisms and so forth. We can talk about those, we don't have time. But I think the important point here to note is that none of those ideas or other factors introduce the idea of evolution as a chance process. Instead, to be honest, they tend to go in the other direction. They reflect the fact that evolution is a very constrained process. Now, so far we've been thinking mainly of evolution at the molecular level, whereas in practice most biologists, of course, are studying evolution, as we were thinking this morning, at the animal level, the plant level, and so forth, the population level. And at this level also, there are many striking observations which illustrate that evolution is very far from being a chance process or a random process. And so let me just mention one example here of what we call constraints in the evolutionary process. And this example is provided by the well-known phenomenon known as evolutionary convergence. If evolution was a random or chance process at this upper level, the organism level, then you might expect that animals and plants would invariably find different adaptive solutions to the challenge of living in a particular environment. But that is not what is observed in practice. In reality, evolutionary convergence refers to the repeated but independent development of the same biochemical pathway or organ or structure in different biological lineages. In other words, as animals or plants face the challenges of adapting to particular environments, so at independent times and in independent circumstances, the evolutionary process has converged to the same adaptive solutions in hundreds of cases, generating very similar ways of meeting the challenge. And some of these adaptations are so remarkably similar, it's difficult to believe that a particular species with the adaptive structure did not evolve from the other. But such is not the case. We know that very clearly from evolution in different continents that have had no contact at all. And I just want to give you a single example of convergence just to make the point here, although I could give you many hundreds of examples. So one of the most famous examples of evolution of convergence is the evolution of the eye. 96% of all animal species contain a complex optical system. And there are 10 main types of eye, but mostly they fall into two categories. They're either camera eyes or compound eyes. And despite their complexity, both those types have evolved independently multiple times, in quite different evolutionary lineages, perhaps more than 40 times, some people think up to 100 times. And as the name suggests, camera eyes work on the same principle as a kind of pinhole camera, shown there on the screen, with light entering the eye via the pupil and then passing through the gel inside to focus on the retina, and then the retina and the nerves interpret, the brain really sees, the brain interprets what's going on there. So that's a wonderful example, and we can see it most vividly here by just looking at a human eye compared to the octopus eye. You know, this is an example of the cephalopods, squid, octopus, and then on the left-hand side of the screen you have the eyes of vertebrates. And you see there, immediately, you see these very striking similarities. There's some interesting differences as well. We needn't pause, but really the structure is so similar. And these eyes evolved independently, independent lineages. And so a wonderful, amazing example, really, of convergent evolution. And so evolution is looking for design space. It's carrying on searching and looking until the best solution is found for that particular function that's needed here on planet Earth. Now, we don't have time to talk more about that, but there are plenty of fine books available on the subject of evolutionary convergence. Here's one of them by Professor Simon Kommo-Morris from my own university, who wrote this wonderful book, Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe, which I think might be in Turkish, I'm not quite sure. And so he's got other books as well, and you'll find many, many examples of evolutionary convergence there. I'm going to finish with just making a couple of brief comments about the possible implications of this sort of discussion for teleology, you know, the sense of goal or purpose. What is the overall purpose of the evolutionary process? And as we've been thinking already during this conference, I mean, evolution has been used in support of almost every ideology you can imagine: capitalism, communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism, every ism. Okay, evolution has been used in support of that. Often they're contradictory, you know, so they can't all work, can they? And so evolution gives a great historical example of how big theories in science can be used ideologically. Now, one of the examples I want to give you is, just briefly here, is historical. And if we have time, I'll give you a contemporary example as well. You may have come across Jacques Monod, and he's a French molecular biologist. 1970, it's an old book now. He wrote this book, Chance and Necessity. And he argued, Jacques Monod, since evolution was based on chance, then he said the universe must be sort of like based on metaphysical chance. He derived metaphysical chance from what he thought was biological chance. And he concludes from the molecular biology that was known in the 1960s, he says that man knows now that he is like a gypsy camping on the edge of the universe where he must live. The universe is deaf to his music, indifferent to his hopes, as to his suffering or his crimes. And so you get here the idea that chance somehow rules over everything, almost as if it was like an agency or metaphysical principle. And it's interesting to read here with respect to genetic mutations. Monod wrote, and I quote from Monod here, "We say these events are accidental due to chance, and since they constitute the only possible source of modifications in the genetic text, itself the sole repository of the organism's hereditary structures, it necessarily follows that chance alone is at the source of every innovation of all creation in the biosphere, and nothing warrants the supposition or the hope that conceptions about this should or ever could be revised." It's much like preaching, isn't it? When you read that text. And so here, I mean, Monod is sort of looking like chance, almost like a metaphysical agency. And you get this feeling when people go for the Milli Piango, don't you? Like, chance, will somehow overrule and give them a winning ticket. But of course, chance doesn't do anything. Chance doesn't do anything. Chance is simply our human way of understanding the way that certain processes work. That's all it is. And so actually, the interesting thing here is Monod was simply wrong. I mean, he was just wrong about the science as it turns out. We know that mutations are not really random in a mathematical sense as we've been thinking. And anyway, evolution is highly constrained, it's highly organized, it depends on the laws of chemistry and physics. I mean, it's a very constrained process with inevitable outcomes. It's going to happen. You won't change it. It's going to happen that way. If you need eyes on planet Earth, you'll get an eye, okay? You know, we can say that, I think, quite strongly if you look at the history of evolution. And so this sort of existential idea that Monod has, that somehow we're like a gypsy camping on the edge of the universe where we must live, I just found that a little bit strange, that whole claim. Okay, that's one example. Another example where someone's trying to build a metaphysical worldview comes from Daniel Dennett. We've already quoted from him, and where he claims that evolution is the product of a blind algorithmic process. He says evolution is not a process that was designed to produce us. But I think, you know, that attempt to extrapolate into an atheistic philosophy out of evolution is just mistaken, you know. I mean, evolution is not a blind algorithmic process. I mean, it's a very carefully organized, highly structured, as I say, and process. And definitely, it's not necessarily purposeless. So I would just want to say that the processes, the mechanisms of evolution tell us that it's not necessarily purposeless. It doesn't tell us what the purpose is, but go the other way, if you're a philosopher, it tells you that it's not necessarily purposeless. Well, we've talked about theology. I'm not going to talk more about theology. I just want to close, actually, with a quotation from a Scottish. We have a Scottish, well, not Scottish person, but someone now from Scotland coming to speak to us soon, Bethany. And here's a quote from someone called Henry Drummond, who lived at the time of Darwin, and he was a great enthusiast for Darwin and evolution. He was also a professor in a church seminary in Glasgow, which is in Scotland, and he wrote this book called The Ascent of Man. I just want to finish with this quote from Henry Drummond. I think it's quite interesting. He said that evolution is seen to be neither more nor less than the story of creation as told by those who know it best. And then he goes on to say, natural selection is a real and beautiful acquisition to natural theology, and the origin was perhaps the most important contribution to the literature of apologetics to have appeared during the 19th century. Now, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Apologetics for him, of course, was the defense of his own Christian faith. That's what he meant by apologetics. And he just saw that evolution was a wonderful way of doing that, and I found that quite fascinating. A lot of people think that somehow it was a big reaction against Darwin. There were some people who criticized The Origin of Species when it first came out, but there were many from my own Christian tradition, who simply, you know, incorporated it within their theology quite easily, and they didn't really have a lot of problem. And here's one example. Okay, a few books, those are in English, might be helpful to some people. Is There a Purpose in Biology is a book which actually goes into more detail of what I've been saying here. Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose, is in Turkish. I have a copy down here if you're interested. And also, Are We Slaves to Our Genes, is about behavioral genetics, somewhat relevant. So thank you very much for your attention. Over to you for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Sevgili konuklar, şimdi soru-cevap kısmına geçiyoruz. Sorularınız varsa alabiliriz.
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question. I was putting these on. Could you just repeat the question? Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I can say he wants to ask, is ontological chance possible for God?
Yeah.
He's asking if ontological chance is possible for God. Now we are looking for translation, but I am saying in English.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Sure. I mean, to me, so my theology is very simple. Okay, so except I've gone to the front there, so that's not very helpful anyway. So to me, God is the author of creation, and the author of a book writes every chapter, and he writes every sentence, in the sense that everything is upheld upheld and sustained by God's authorship. And so I see God as the primary cause of all that exists, and what we study as scientists are the secondary causes. Anyway, I've gone over it, never mind. Oh, there we are. Yeah, so what we do in scientific investigation is to investigate the secondary causes whereby everything that exists, right? So I don't think we can never say God is omnipotent. In all the Abrahamic faiths, God is omnipotent. God is all-knowing. God is omnipresent. God can do what he wants. So I think sometimes you find a tendency to try and limit God to our own human understanding. Now, can we predict ontological chance? No, we cannot. We're not in that position. But God knows all things. And so personally, not everyone agrees with this. This is my personal view. I believe God, there is no chance with God. God knows everything that can be known. And that includes, if you want to ask the question, when will the next beta particle emission be from a phosphorus-32 radioisotope? Does God know that? Absolutely, I think so, yes. So I don't think this distinction between epistemic and ontological chance is a human invention. We're describing our own experience as humans as we look at God's wonderful creation. But I don't think we can apply that to God, myself. God is the primary cause of all that exists. That would be my view. Thank you.
Thanks to Dennis Alexander for his speech and answer. It's end.
Done. Okay, yeah, sit down. I heard your voice, but didn't see you.